Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Sherlocktober. This is our read-along for the entire month of October. We're reading some of the cream of the crop of the Sherlock Holmes canon. And this week, we're reading 6 short stories from the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. We're reading The Adventure of Silverblaze, about a racing horse. The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, which harkens back to some of the grotesquerie of The Adventure of the Speckled Man. The Adventure of the Crooked Man. The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, The Adventure of the Naval Treaty, and The Adventure of the Final Problem. Let me get to my spot here. I picked these 6 stories not only for, well, of course, you pick the last one. You have to read The Final Problem if you're going to read Sherlock Holmes, even a first run-through. But I picked the others mainly because our previous batch of stories showed us that Arthur Conan Doyle had a clear decision made to show Holmes operating on all levels of the extremely stratified world of Victorian society. And I picked these stories mainly because they are so picturesque. they're so exotic, and also because of some of the characters that we get introduced to. 2 in particular. so let me get to them. They are I want to hear what you thought of all the stories, the dubious racing details behind Silverblaze. Racing fans have of course said since the minute that it appeared that it shows that Doyle knew nothing whatsoever about the racing world, and also the curious scientific and even evolutionary details in The Man with the Crooked Lip. That likewise, I want to know what you make of those. But there are 2 towering guest starring characters in these stories, and they're the highlight of what I want to talk about today and get your impressions of. The first of them, of course, being Mycroft Holmes, The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, the brother of Sherlock Holmes, who it turns out, amazingly, of course, Holmes has never talked about his family to Watson, and it turns out that Doyle has the genius idea of making Sherlock Holmes not exceptional in his family. His brother, Mycroft, is, if anything, more brilliant than he is in the science of deduction and inference. And he actually tells us that. You wonder, said my companion, why it is that Mycroft does not use his powers for detective work. He is incapable of it. But I thought you said... I said that he was my superior in observation and deduction. If the art of detection began and ended in reasoning from an armchair, my brother would be the greatest criminal agent that ever lived. But he has no ambition and no energy. He will not even go out of his way to verify his own solutions, and would rather be considered wrong than take the trouble to prove himself right. Again and again I have taken the problem to him and have received an explanation which has afterwards proved to be the correct one. And yet he was absolutely incapable of working out the practical points which must be gone into before a case could be laid before a judge or jury. In other words, Mycroft knows the theory, but he would never throw himself flat upon a carpet with a magnifying glass the way Holmes does. He would never put the links in the chain together. In other words, Mycroft could never have a Watson. He would never bother to explain the intermediary steps, that gimmick that we have seen Doyle do many times, where Holmes will come out with some statement and Watson will say, "Oh, come now, you couldn't possibly have known that," forcing Holmes to go through it. Mycroft doesn't make those daisy chains of causation and, if A then B, if B then C. He doesn't do that because he's an extremely solitary person. We see that the Diogenes Club, where he spends his social time, is a club for misfits, where there's very little conversation at all. When Holmes does take Watson to the Diogenes Club and they meet Mycroft Holmes, Mycroft and and Sherlock engage in kind of a dual observation on a stranger that they look down on the street, and they mystify Watson. But it turns out that they're just playing what we get. I get anyway, the strong impression that it's a long-standing parlor game between the 2 of them. And you can easily picture when you see them doing that, diagnosing what this man they're looking at is, where he served, when he stopped, what his family life is like, and so on, all by what they can observe. And with Mycroft coming out slightly better. Sherlock makes a small mistake, one that he would probably have corrected instantly himself in a normal adventure, but with Mycroft right there, he doesn't have a chance. But when we're watching this, I could easily picture them as kids doing it, sharpening each other's logic, but with completely different personalities. I think that's just fascinating. And it's led to a great deal of Mycroft fan fiction. There's an enormous amount of Mycroft Holmes fan fiction that fans just don't want to admit that he's not a dramatic character and that therefore he should not be a dramatic lead. Or they just don't want to. They make him something else. He appears all over the Sherlock Holmes pastiche fiction landscape, and usually he is given far more energy than he has. Either that, or he is equipped with an Archie Goodwin. Those of you who know your murder mystery fiction will know immediately what I'm talking about, because it turns out that one of the people who was fascinated by the idea of Mycroft Holmes actually solving crimes was Rex Stout, who created Nero Wolfe, an enormous aesthete character who scarcely ever moves, as he tells us himself, and who has a dog's body. He has an everyman agent named Archie Goodwin who does all the running around for him. Now, we're told that Mycroft doesn't have anyone like that. But in the follow-up to this story, Mycroft's other appearance, we're told that he not only works for the British government, but could be said in many ways to be the British government. So he could have such a person, or many such people. I have always thought that a truly brilliant piece of Mycroft Holmes fan fiction, pastiche fiction, has yet to be written. I think it would be not Mycroft Holmes proving that he is every bit as energetic and go-getter a sleuth hound as his brother Sherlock, but rather an Edwardian version of the George Smiley novels of John le Carré. I think of the perfect Mycroft Holmes fan fiction would be one that is incredibly political. Not that, as Mycroft Holmes fan fiction tends to do, where the politics is what Mycroft distracts himself from with some outre crime like the kind that his brother is always solving, but rather spy work, the great game, with Mycroft at the center. I think that would be fascinating. If any of you know if that approach has ever been taken, please let me know, because I would love to read that. I've often thought I might like to write it, but maybe that's just a lingering aftercurse of having a brilliant sibling. But one way or another, the other towering figure in these stories makes his appearance on the stage in the last of the stories that we're dealing with today, The Final Problem. And that figure is Professor Moriarty, who is the author of an impressive monograph on the motion of comets, and who is a mathematician, and who is also the Napoleon of crime, a spider at the web of all that is illegal and half that is evil in the city of London. He has a massive... Frida is trying to grab this. She's trying to grab my bookmark, and she may not have my bookmark. She has everything. I give her everything. You may not have my bookmark. You may not. We finally meet Professor Moriarty because, as Holmes puts it, Holmes tells Watson that he has been vying with Moriarty as these two invisible figures on these two polar opposites, equally brilliant, in London for months. What does he tell him? He saw every step I took to draw my toils around him. Again and again he strove to break away, but as often headed him off. I tell you, my friend, that if a detailed account of that silent contest could be written, it would take its place as the most brilliant bit of thrust and parry work in the history of detection. And Holmes is telling Watson this in the context of telling him that one day, while Holmes was at 221B Baker Street, he received a visit from Professor Moriarty, and was sufficiently alarmed when he realized who was at his door, unannounced and unexpected, that he slips a revolver into his dressing gown pocket, thinking that he might need it. And that Moriarty notices that right away, because this is an evil Sherlock Holmes. This is someone every bit as smart, every bit as good at all the deduction games that we've seen so far. He notices right away and says, evidently, you don't know me. And Holmes takes the bait as a general question and says, I think I know you quite well. And they have a wonderful exchange. I want to read you a bit of it. Moriarty takes out a notebook to sort of, as a schoolmaster, to sort of read off Sherlock Holmes' offenses, which is what led the writer to make Moriarty the maligned and totally innocent, befuddled mathematics professor Moriarty, the villain of a Sherlock Holmes pastiche in which Holmes is obsessed with destroying him because he was an old teacher. But anyway, the moment is, "You crossed my path on the 4th of January, said he. On the 23rd, you incommoded me. By the middle of February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March, I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position through your continual persecution that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming an impossible one. Have you any suggestion to make?" Holmes asked him. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," he said, swaying his face about. We're told that Moriarty undulates his face in a curiously reptilian way. "You must, really, you know." "After Monday," said Holmes, because Monday is when Holmes's own efforts against Moriarty are going to come to conclusion. "Tut, tut," he said. "I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see that there can be but one outcome to this affair. It is necessary that you should withdraw. You have worked things in such a fashion that we have only one resource left. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say, unaffectedly, that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take any extreme measure. You smile, sir, but I assure you it really would." That's a huge compliment, coming from the figure that we gather Moriarty is. "Danger is part of my trade," Holmes tells him. "This is not danger," said he. "It is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization, the full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have been unable to realize. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot." "I am afraid," Holmes tells him, rising, "that in the pleasure of this conversation I am neglecting business of importance which awaits me elsewhere." He rose also and looked at me in silence, shaking his head sadly. "Well, well," he said at last, "it seems a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You can do nothing before Monday. It has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you that I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you." "You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," Holmes tells him. "Let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interest of the public, cheerfully accept the latter." "I can promise you the one, but not the other," says Moriarty, and he leaves, and we know from that encounter what's going to come. We know it as sure as it's going to be, and sure enough, the game goes out of London and to foreign parts, and we end up at the Reichenbach Falls, and we end up with Dr. Watson being drawn off with a decoy so that Holmes and Moriarty confront each other alone at the lip of a ledge at the top of a staggeringly violent waterfall. And they grapple, and they fight, and they're gone. Over the edge, with no possibility, what does it say? Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, down deep in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of that generation. And that's how we end our Sherlock Holmes this time around, with the apparent death of the main character. And those of you who read a lot of murder mysteries or thrillers just in general, or really any kind of modern fiction these days, will think, oh yeah, well, big deal. We all know how this works. If it's a seething cauldron of water and foam, or whether it's an explosion or a plane crash or whatever, unless you see the body, the person's not dead. Not the person might not be dead, but the person definitely isn't dead. If the author wants you to know that a character is dead, they will show you the body. And even then, in some cases. But one way or another, if there's no body, if two people fall over the falls and into the foam, and nothing is recovered, then you can be sure, according to the dictates of the genre, that at least one of them is not dead. The thing to remember is that wasn't specifically the rule. That didn't become much enormously imitated until Arthur Conan Doyle did it. And the thing to remember is that Arthur Conan Doyle didn't do it as a gimmick. He did it for real. He was sick of Sherlock Holmes. he was sick of this character who had brought him fame and fortune. Reflects it often in the stories. It's no secret. It's no coincidence that when Holmes talks about Watson's own stories about Sherlock Holmes, he derides them as mere sensationalism. And that fame through Watson's stories has spread. Mycroft Holmes tells Dr. Watson when they meet that I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became his chronicler. Doyle wasn't kidding. He actually thought this would be the death of, that it would be the perfect culminating act, the perfect finish for both his great villain and his great hero. And the public was outraged. The public had no idea. The public had come to feel an affection for this character in a far greater degree than ever occurred to Doyle as possible. But he was adamant. He was a stubborn man, and he was adamant that Holmes would not return. He had higher hopes for his other literary venues, and he had a busy life outside of literature as well. I don't think he anticipated, in fact I'm sure, that he did not anticipate the extent to which the public clamor would grow. The idea that members of the reading public would accost an author in public to bring back a favorite character had almost never happened in modern literature, in the age of the printing press. That had almost never happened. And it started to happen to Doyle. But he was adamant, and that ends, our Sherlock Holmes reading ends here with Holmes gone. And the thing that we're reading next, the thing that we're reading for next Sunday, is the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it or are not familiar with Holmes, you might think, oh my God, we're going to go from reading a handful of short stories to reading a whole novel? Isn't that a little much to ask when we've got all sorts of cocaine to do? And I'm here to tell you, unless your reading tastes are drastically different than what I'm thinking, The Hound of the Baskervilles will work on you. You will love it. You will not consider it a burden to read this novel at all. It is the perfect combination of thrilling and atmospheric. And it brings back Holmes in a way. So we'll do that next time. So next Sunday we will meet here together, 221B Baker Street, and we will read The Hound of the Baskervilles. By far the most famous novel that Arthur Conan Doyle ever wrote. Bitter wormwood to him. He was surely hoping it would be his historical novels, but no. And also one of the most famous novels ever written, if you think about it. Most people don't like to consider it because it's so lowbrow. But nevertheless, I think it's a safe bet to say that roughly 100 times as many people have read The Hound of the Baskervilles as have read Pride and Prejudice. I think that's a safe thing to say. That might cause some of the finer literary sensibilities to recoil just a bit, but I think it's undeniably true. But one way or another, we'll come back next week and we'll talk about The Hound of the Baskervilles, and that will be a lot of fun. And in the meantime, of course, I want to know in the comments what you made of these stories. What did you think of The Man with the Crooked Lip, of The Twisted Lip? What did you think of Silver Blaze? Again, Silver Blaze is tremendously atmospheric. And of course, what did you think of The Final Problem? Good Lord. But one way or another, let's talk all about it. And in the meantime, I'll wrap this up. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.